Well, welcome to the next episode of Theologically Speaking. I'm Dr. Billy Gocher, and I'm here with a newly minted D-Min student, Doctor of Ministry student, Michael Carlisle. And Michael and I go back a few years. We actually were together in Michigan.
Yeah, we go back 20 years.
Yeah. So this process began a few years back. You want to share a word about that?
Yeah, well, 20 years ago, I was a sales and marketing manager working in Detroit, and not yet Dr. Gocher was the pastor of Grace Baptist Church of Waterford. My wife and I were members there at Waterford for about 3.5 years. And in the course of that, the Lord used the ministry at Grace Baptist of Waterford and some of the missionaries that were being supported by Grace of Waterford to draw me into ministry, and that's really it's why I'm writing this dissertation at all. So it was really, to me, probably the most special thing about this whole experience of getting the doctor of ministry was to have the pastor that the Lord used to draw me into ministry be part of my committee for the oral defense. That was just a really special moment for me, and I will never forget it. I'll never forget it.
I won't either. That is really kind of a first full circle moment. And just remember going on missions trips together and just seeing what the Lord directing your steps and being a part of that, actually being a supporting church for you in each places where we've had the privilege of serving.
Yeah.
And then just to be on this end. So, but part of this whole experience and God bringing you into the mission field shaped this project.
Oh, yes. I mean, my friends, of course, most of them are missionaries because I am a missionary today. I work with Bibles International. I'm the scripture engagement manager there. So my department is helping people that are receiving a translation of the Bible in their language for the first time learn how to use the scriptures. And that's necessary when these people are coming from cultures that have animism in their background, or Buddhism or Islam or something else. They've never had a holy book that's part of their day-to-day life. So I've been a missionary in Cambodia for 13 years. I've now been with BI for 3 years. So most of my colleagues are overseas missionaries, and they say, well, what did you do your dissertation on? And they expect something having to do with intercultural studies, like cross-cultural ministry to the Cambodian people would be a natural thing. But this dissertation is for Americans.
Yeah.
It's made for American pastors preaching ancient Mediterranean texts to modern American people. And because I had been a missionary in Cambodia for 13 years, just living in that community, speaking their language on a day-to-day basis, learning how they develop meaning differently than we do, changed the way that I think in ways that people back home in the States really started picking up on. In fact, my mother said this to me last night. She's here for graduation. And she was talking about how much I changed as a person, the way that I think and communicate after living in Cambodia for 13 years. And so that whole, like you said, full circle, being at Grace Baptist of Waterford, serving in Cambodia in a place where I walk out the front door and I'm done with the English-speaking world all day long, how that changed me. And now I come back to the States because I'm stationed here in Michigan now, and I'm preaching more for American churches, and it was awkward. It was very difficult. I felt that I could connect the Bible more easily to Cambodian villagers than I could with Americans. And I was born and raised here, and I went to seminary here. And then after just, 10 years or so in Cambodia, I felt this was a lot harder than it was in Cambodia, and I'm speaking a second language with a second culture. So yeah, that's part of the circle that I went around as we got to this part of the process.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating study because it just addresses so many ways that we almost assume, we tend to assume that the person speaking to us, when we use especially the same words, that we have the same meaning in those words. But yet when you actually live and operate in another culture,
You find out that's not true.
yes, you begin to find out, even though we can come up with the word that you use in Khmer or I use in English to describe an object, but then how we put a sentence together and convey meaning is radically different.
Very different, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so words actually have very minimal meaning. There's not much meaning in the word itself, but people use words, and they have much more meaning in their mind when they use those words. And it's important for both communicators to have the same meaning in mind. If they don't, that's where we start having the intercultural communications problem. And before this, you and I were talking about I had mentioned John 3:16.
Right.
You know, by word number 2 in John 3:16, a Cambodian's confused.
Yep.
Because what they mean by the word God in their language is not the same thing they mean by the word God, or we mean by the word God in ours. And even if a Cambodian learned to speak English, he would use the English word God according to his cultural thinking.
Right.
And even if an American learns to speak Khmer, he would use their word for God with his cultural understanding of that word. And that's where a lot of the miscommunication happens. And we don't normally think that would happen when I'm reading a Bible.
Right.
I got saved when I was 13. And I've read this thing front to back, I don't know how many times. But a lot of the time, I have, quite by accident, been reading my own American ideas into the words of ancient Mediterranean people. And that's really what this dissertation is about.
Absolutely. And it shows just part of the communication process. And I thought that's a good thing to illustrate. So maybe an illustration of how when you first began to communicate to the Cambodians and bringing, if you would, a Western perspective, began to create clear obstacles.
Yeah. So I did pretty well in seminary with the languages. I really enjoyed it. So when I got to Cambodia, I really enjoyed studying their language as well. And I learned it, you know, there was some book learning, there was some classroom instruction, but where I really, you know, I strived with learning conversational Khmer, talking with people, ideally being a fly on the wall and listening to them. And I picked up the language very quickly. So, you know, I've just come out of seminary like 3 years before I got to this point. I'm now speaking their language fairly fluently, preaching the Bible on texts that I have known for a long time since I was a kid. And I get done and they're confused. You know, they're looking at me like, what is he, we don't understand what he's talking about really. And I address a lot of the reasons why in the dissertation, but as an American, I'm even just processing information differently than the Cambodian villagers are. I'm not thinking about life in the really concrete terms that somebody that lives in an agricultural cycle whose life is dominated by the agricultural cycle, their thinking is very different than ours. And so I would preach and I would be speaking words that they know and using correct grammar for the most part. I'm sure I made mistakes, but it wasn't reaching into their lives and it wasn't speaking to them because it sounded like I was using their language to speak American thoughts, if I can put it that way.
Sure.
I was using their language to speak American thoughts about the Bible.
All right.
How many cultures do I have involved there?
Yep.
3.
Yep.
Ancient Mediterranean men. I'm now interpreting that and thinking about it and preaching it through this American worldview, and now it's going to ancient or to modern Cambodians.
Right.
And it took me about a good 5 to 7 years to really get to the point where I could connect this text to their lives. And to be quite honest with you, I found that a lot easier than preaching here. I learned in the course of my research that certain things about day-to-day life in rural Asia are much more similar to ancient Mediterranean life than American life. And it makes a world of difference in communication. And so that's part of what I wanted to bring into the dissertation was, how is it that the people in the Bible think and communicate with each other? How is that the same as Cambodians? And why is it different from me? Why was my first preaching experience, you know, something I'm embarrassed about now? I was just telling you, there are sermons up there on sermon audio I wish we could take down.
Yeah.
You can go and find them, but you wouldn't understand them because they're in Khmer. But, you know, how do I bridge that gap? And then how do I help people here that have never had that opportunity that I had to live in Cambodia and to actually go through the process of change, learn how to understand the ancient Mediterranean people better?
Right. And that's, you know, I've had the privilege of teaching in multiple cultures.
Yeah.
And I've often, at times, you know, especially when you're dealing with a translator and you don't know the language, but you say so much and then they spend a lot longer communicating. And I'm kind of like, so is this just your own? But the reality is, as I've learned with my translators, there's just conceptual ways to explain something that I'm not knowing their culture, they have to take a lot longer to explain a concept that I think was pretty straightforward. But then as we converse about it, I begin to expose me to the worldview from which is shaping this communication.
From the other side of that bridge, I know that you have used an illustration you thought would clarify this. But as a translator, I'm like, okay, this is going to be hard. And that's when I start talking longer than you did.
Right.
And,
Oh, yeah.
and you're wondering what I'm saying.
Sure.
But my point is, you said that because you thought it would make it easier and more clear to understand, but because of the cultural differences, actually made it a little bit harder.
Right. That I feel without knowing the culture, I can't have fully experienced the gap. But I think what's fascinating too, and pushing in maybe a little bit deeper on this, is that there's a tendency, especially because we have such biblical literacy, if you will, familiarity, that we don't often stop and consider that the writers of Scripture came from a culture different than ours.
Yeah.
And because of that, we tend to interpret their words like they're coming from our culture.
Right.
Without understanding. So it gets back into that historical understanding, which sometimes I think we just thought of history as just kind of more lineage, like where we are in time.
Yeah, a series of events.
Right.
Yeah.
Rather than history being a culture. So I think that's part of what you were pushing into.
Yeah. So actually in the introduction, I give just a short 2-page testimony about how I got to this point with the dissertation, why I chose this topic and got to it. And one of the things that was part of my experience was my wife and I and my family, we served in a very rural part of Cambodia. There were no foreigners around for 100 miles, or I should say 160 kilometers or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And we were a shock to a lot of people. And like I said earlier, when you walked out my front door, you left the English-speaking world behind. When you were taller, like a foot taller than everybody else around you, and you're the only white person around, and everybody points at you and says, look, it's a foreigner, you really begin to get a sense of how foreign you are to the Cambodian people. I mean, you don't go anywhere without feeling like you stick out like a sore thumb. And one of the important things about this for me was realizing that I'm as much a foreigner to the ancient Mediterranean apostles and prophets and the first audience of Scripture as I was to Cambodians. I had always assumed, like you just said, and it's so right, there were ways that I assumed that the people in the Bible are like me that are simply not true. And I found out later, like I said, in the course of research, to find out that Cambodians and ancient Mediterranean people are a lot closer together in certain ways than we are. Now, biblical background theology, yes, we're closer to the ancient Mediterranean writers, no doubt about it, no contest there. But in cultural ways, when I realized that, it caused a thirst in me as a missionary. You know, I always wanted to learn the Cambodian culture and be able to communicate freely with them. That same thirst for me as a missionary went the other direction and pointed me at the Bible that way. I want to learn about these ancient Mediterranean people and how they think and communicate and what their cultural values and what their worldview is like better, so that when I am reading their words, I'm understanding more of what they actually intended for their first audience to understand.
And I think that pushes into some of the topics you mentioned in here, which gets into part of an honor-shame society and having a little bit more collectivist rather than individualistic perspective. And that does have a massive impact on communication and on how you say it and what you're intending to send, the messages being sent.
You just opened like 3 cans of worms, unpacked there. But let me give you a quick illustration. And again, this is in the introduction. One of my first responsibilities in Cambodia was to teach a pastor named T. He had been ordained. He had received quite a bit of training through Forrest MacPhail, a missionary in Cambodia. He was my mentor. But it was like informal training because we didn't have all the theological books, didn't have a book on interpretation, a book on exegesis, a book on homiletics, didn't have that stuff. So it was informal discipleship kind of training. And Forrest wanted me to do more with T. So T was the pastor. I did not preach on a weekly basis. I did teach to give T some examples. And I say this in the dissertation, once in a while, T would like one day he picked up a psalm and he preached an allegory on it. And I'm like, oh, no. How do I undo this allegory so that people don't think this is the way to interpret the Bible without shaming him in front of everybody?
Right.
But he more often shamed me by seeing things in the text that I had completely overlooked. And the honor shame thing is one of the most important things. It's like he would start preaching on something in the text there, a text I'm familiar with, and say something I had never said about it. And then I look down at my Bible and I'm like, this is very clearly here. It's just as an American, because we're an egalitarian society, and we don't think in terms of these complex social structures with honor and shame. This just blew right past me. I didn't even see it as it went past. And T's like, this is a really important thing in the text we have to talk about. And he's right. I went to seminary and got an MDiv, and here's a guy that has a high school education in Cambodia and no formal theological education. And he is legitimately pulling things out of the text that are there that I did not.
That's a very helpful illustration. Yeah. So any texts come to mind, like one of the communication points that you just saw so clearly where the honor shame points in and then we tend to run right over the top of it?
Well, I don't want to say all of us. I know that I did. Where I realized this for the first time was when he preached on Esther 1 and the shame that Queen Vashti caused the king.
Okay.
And I read that text today, and I don't usually, for my devotions, read from an English Bible. I still read from a Cambodian Bible because the honor shame words are like full color for me.
Gotcha.
Whereas the English is more black and white. I'm seeing the same image, but it's in black and white, low definition. But in Khmer, I'm reading it more like in full color and high definition. The honor shame, even if I read it in English, just jumps off the page at me. Whereas before I went to Cambodia, it would have been like, yeah, you seem to be embarrassed by this.
Right.
But I'm now seeing in more depth what's going on there.
Gotcha. Yeah. So even within the Cambodian language, because they have an honor shame society, the way they use the words communicate that even more pronounced than like an English translation is going to bring. So I'm assuming that also plays out then as you study back into Greek and Hebrew, that has an honor shame coloring in it that perhaps we haven't seen as clearly as we should.
Well, I would even go a step further than that. I would say that our language is filled with honor shame words. But going back to this reality that the words mean little, but speakers and listeners mean a lot by those words, we don't place the same meaning behind those words in our language that a Cambodian does in the equivalent words in their language.
Gotcha.
So, like, for example, the English word despised. For us now, that means more like to hate, but it actually means to think of something as worth little, something as, it's a shame word.
Right.
It's to say, if somebody is despised, it's not necessarily that I hate you, but it's that you are worth a whole lot less. But our cultural meaning behind those words as modern Americans is different than our English-speaking ancestors who were in a more honor-shame culture.
Sure.
So I think that's part of, for me, is there's kind of like two halves of me. There's a half of me that's the English-speaking American. And when I read the Bible in English, it just doesn't naturally bring up that. The same equivalent words don't bring up the same depth of meaning that it would in Khmer, but you're right. I mean, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Israelites through Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, they would have seen a lot more depth in these terms than we do. And that's why I kind of use the illustration of, high versus low definition and black and white versus full color.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think despise is a good term because for us, I despise something, I just don't like it. But I'm not equating value. Like I don't see myself as more valuable.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And so in an honor shame, if I say you're despised, you're low status. And that's somebody as their higher status. So to despise is to diminish their status, both not just personally in conversation, but in a community.
Yeah.
And that would then set them in a level of shame around their community because they were despised.
So before the podcast, we're talking about perspicuity,
Right.
the least clear word about clarity that I know in the English language.
That's good.
Perspicuity.
Yes.
the general message of the Bible and the gospel is clear enough to be understood, but you can see how the different ways of thinking about the words and the cultural ideas behind them
Right.
can make them a little bit less clear, or can even, I think what you just pointed out is like change the subject from one of value, greater or lesser value, to something that I hate,
Right.
which is a different but related idea. Understanding their culture can, I think, add a lot of clarity to the way we perceive Scripture. And that's what I'm trying to do through especially chapter 3 in the dissertation, is really open up the way ancient Mediterranean people thought about their social structures and their family structures and the words they use in their language, to help us bring some of that color into
Right.
our Bible reading, so that we're seeing more clearly the message that's there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the interesting parts of the thesis that you even brought up is that, when we go to teach the Bible into another culture, the first thing we actually need to do is do the exegetical work on the culture itself.
Yes.
That I need to understand that culture and how it communicates, so that I actually understand the obstacles of me taking this message to this culture. And so there's where, so that we had that conversation early, but I think it's really well. I mean, you made the statement, the Bible cannot be used as a primary evidence due to the reader's culturally conditioned worldview, which shapes his perspective. So maybe flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah. So this was a problem I came across trying to think of, how am I going to prove my thesis in the dissertation? In theological studies, we want to use the Bible as the proof, and rightly
Right.
so.
Sure.
This is what we want to use to prove our arguments, because we want the Scriptures to stand in authority over us. But as a Scripture reading, if I'm reading the words of ancient Mediterranean men and I am bringing my own American meaning to the text, well, this is no longer standing in authority over me
Right.
in a real practical way, not intentional,
But
but just in the concrete outworking of it. My own thoughts and culture and worldview are actually standing in authority over the text. So I can't use the text as evidence, because if I say, well, the text is trying to, first of all, the biblical writer is not trying to prove collectivism
Right.
or honor shame. He's using it. There's a
Right.
difference between the two. So I couldn't use the Bible as primary evidence. So I tried to approach it from kind of the same way that I learned it, from a third culture that's more similar to the people in the Bible. And that's where I got into anthropological study and trying to find out what kinds of people in living cultures today are more like the people in the Bible, and how does that change the way that they think. Now, that's my primary evidence, and if we can learn something about that, and we can learn more about how the ancient biblical writers thought and communicated, that will help us understand them better, like you were just saying. And this is one thing, I think you kind of touched on a very important point. My core topic here is contextualization and applying that to exegetical preaching. And you brought up exegeting the cultures.
Right.
And so Paul Hebert, who I quote quite a bit in this, he talked about that. He's the one that brought up that discussion. As a missionary, I need to exegete. He's talking about two cultures,
Sure.
the biblical culture and the receptor culture.
Right.
And there's actually a third one involved in a missionary, because I'm now the third one, right? And it's going through me. But as Americans, we have two cultures. We have the cultures of the Bible and the culture here in the States. And we have to exegete both of those cultures and learn how these people think, and how I'm going to connect their words and their meaning to people that think and communicate in quite different ways.
That's excellent. And it is a part of, again, I love the study. I love what where we're leaning in to think more clearly. Because part of it, all of us deal with presuppositions, and we know that, even as we talk
we don't
about
know
it.
them. We know that, but we don't know them.
Right, we don't know them well, right? Yeah, but that's part of, even if we talk about that often in hermeneutics or in theology, being very careful not to color with your presupposition. There's an extent to which we wrestle to understand fully how much presuppositions we bring.
Yeah.
And part of what I often talk about in theology is that God's rewriting our presuppositions with biblical truth to help us to think theologically. And that's part of our sanctification process. But then understanding the cultural nuances, the cultures, how it communicates, then helps us to be really, I mean, mine out the full intent of the biblical authors, which is what the goal of hermeneutics is.
Yeah, that's on page 1 of my dissertation, because that's really so important to me. The idea of authorial intent, and really the locus of meaning being strongly connected to authorial intent.
Right.
And so rhetorical analysis is very important to the practical side of the dissertation, how I do rhetorical analysis in my exegesis, and how I flesh that out in the sermon is very important, because authorial intent there's a problem in the text.
Right.
Whether it's Peter writing an epistle to people that are going through some problem, or the sin of David with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. Nathan the prophet is facing a problem in that text.
Yep.
And there's a situation there that it's not just a historical thing that happened. There's always a perspective of that historical event that happened. Authorial intent is connected intimately, deeply, to the perspective of that historical problem of the biblical writer, and how he wanted the people hearing his text to respond to that message about that problem. So if I look at that problem and I see it one way, but that's not the same way as the biblical writer, because my culture does, this is not an important thing in my culture, so I just kind of cruise past it.
Right.
Or something else that he said is really important in my culture, and I make that the big idea,
Right.
when actually it's not. There's something else that's the big idea from his perspective. I have a right commitment to authorial intent, but I'm not able to actually flesh it out. And that's, again, because of the cultural perspective. And one of the most helpful comments that I read, I don't remember exactly who did it, who wrote this. It was a communications researcher. He said that worldviews are not so much something we look at, but something we look through. And so I'm looking through my worldview at this situation in the text and seeing it one way, and not realizing that there's another perspective where the biblical writer's looking through his worldview at the situation and seeing the same information, but coming to different conclusions about what's important in it. And that's why rhetorical analysis can't be done from my cultural perspective. If I do the rhetorical analysis from my perspective, I'm seeing the problem, what looks like the problem to an American,
Right.
instead of an ancient Mediterranean man.
Right.
When I get to the sermon, now what is actually the thing that I am trying to change the congregation with?
Right.
Authorial intent, or the pastor's
Yeah.
own world?
Yeah, well, we want the authorial intent so that we're clear on the point, but then we do have to exegete into our culture. So then how does this apply?
Because you have to
But
connect.
we can't get this part in front.
Yeah.
Which
You're putting the cart before the
Right.
horse. Yeah.
That's good. Well, I think it's a great conversation, and I look forward to us continuing this on our next podcast together and look at a practical application of these very points.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you, Michael.